All right, now before we jump into this one, I'm just going to say it straight. This episode might hit a little closer to home than people are used to because we're not talking about the other side today. We're talking about what's happening inside our own circles, our own feeds, and the voices a lot of people trust every single day, and that can get uncomfortable real quick. You're going to hear disagreements that don't fall into the usual boxes. You're going to hear people you normally agree with getting challenged, and yeah, you might even feel that instinct to pick a side before you've actually heard everything out. But that's kind of the point. This isn't about piling on, canceling people, or pretending one voice has all the answers. It's about looking at the bigger picture and asking whether we're actually having honest conversations anymore, or if we've just traded one set of narratives for another that feels more comfortable. So if you're coming in expecting clean lines, easy takes, and everyone staying in their lane, this probably isn't that episode. But if you're willing to sit in the tension for a minute and actually think through what's being said instead of just reacting to it, then you're exactly where you need to be.
Something strange is happening right now, and if you're paying attention, you can feel it. Not out there in the usual political chaos, not in the headlines we've been conditioned to argue about, but inside the very movement that once prided itself on unity, clarity, and direction. The loudest voices that used to stand shoulder to shoulder are now turning on each other, drawing lines, calling each other out, questioning motives, loyalty, and even principles. And for a lot of people watching from the outside, it's confusing as hell. Because this isn't supposed to happen, right? This is the side that pushed back against division, against media manipulation, against fractured messaging. And now suddenly the fracture is internal, and it's getting louder by the day. And maybe the real question isn't why it's happening, but whether it was always going to. Because when a movement grows fast, when it pulls in different ideologies under one banner, when personalities become just as powerful as principles, eventually something has to give. Is this a sign of strength, debate, evolution, refining ideas? Or is this the beginning of something deeper, something that could reshape what the movement even is going forward? Because right now it's not just disagreement, it's a fight over identity, direction, and control of the narrative itself. So tonight, we're not asking who's right and who's wrong. We're asking something bigger. What happens when the side that built itself on challenging the system starts challenging itself? All right, let's bring in the crew tonight, because if there was ever a conversation built for this group, this is it. And I have a feeling this one's going to get a little heated before it's all said and done. First up, Brian is here, bringing that unapologetic MAGA fire, the guy who's going to call it exactly how he sees it, no filter, no hesitation. And if there's a line being drawn inside the movement, you already know he's not just picking a side. He's defending what he believes the movement was always supposed to be in the first place. Then we've got Rachel, keeping things grounded and honest, cutting through the noise, stepping back from the emotional swings and asking the questions a lot of people are thinking but not always saying out loud, especially when things start getting messy inside spaces people usually feel aligned with. Daniel's here too, and this is right in his wheelhouse, because when things start breaking apart, when alliances shift and narratives collide, he's the one connecting the dots, looking at the bigger picture and asking whether this is organic or something deeper playing out behind the scenes that most people aren't even seeing yet. And of course, Skylar is joining us, bringing that progressive perspective, challenging the entire premise from the outside looking in, and probably asking whether this civil war was inevitable from the start, or just the natural result of contradictions that have been building for years. And me, I'm just here trying to keep this thing between the rails, or at least make sure we don't completely derail before we get to the end, because tonight isn't just another headline breakdown. This is about identity, direction, and whether a movement that reshaped the political landscape is now at a crossroads it didn't see coming. All right, let's start here, because this is the question a lot of people are either asking quietly or avoiding completely. What the hell is going on inside the conservative movement right now? You've got major voices going at each other, disagreements over foreign policy, especially around Iran, arguments about what America first actually means in practice. And it's not just polite debate. It's getting personal, it's getting loud, and it's happening in public where everyone can see it. So here's the question I want to throw out first. Is this a healthy debate inside a growing movement? Or is this the beginning of something bigger, like a fracture that could actually weaken it?
Look, I'm going to say what a lot of people are thinking, but maybe not saying out loud. This isn't some collapse. This is what happens when a movement gets big enough that it actually matters. And suddenly everybody wants to define it, control it, or reshape it into their version of what it should be. The difference is real supporters, the backbone of this thing, haven't changed. The principles haven't changed. America First hasn't changed. What's happening right now is you've got voices that built platforms during the rise of the movement, and now they're trying to pivot, adjust, or carve out their own lane. And yeah, that's going to create friction. But friction doesn't mean failure. It means people actually care enough to fight for what they believe is the right direction. And on the Iran issue specifically, this is where the line gets real clear. Either you believe in strength, deterrence, and protecting American interests globally, or you fall back into the same weak posture that got us into messes in the first place. So yeah, there's disagreement, but I'd argue that's a sign this thing is still alive, still evolving, and not some controlled, scripted narrative like the left runs with. The real danger isn't disagreement, it's losing the core identity, and that's what people are fighting to protect right now.
See, and that's where it gets interesting because on one hand, Brian's right. Movements grow, they evolve, and you're going to have internal battles when the stakes get higher. But on the other hand, when those battles start playing out publicly, when the messaging starts splitting, it can create confusion for the people watching and wondering what the movement actually stands for right now. Because if everyone's claiming they represent the real version of it, then what is it exactly? Rachel, I want to bring you in here. When you look at this from the outside of that core base, what do you see? Growth or warning signs?
I think it's both, honestly, and that's what makes this moment more complicated than people want it to be. Because yes, debate can be healthy, disagreement can be productive, and any movement that gets big enough is going to have different factions trying to define its direction. But the difference here is how public and how personal it's becoming. When you start seeing people who were once aligned openly questioning each other's motives, loyalty, or even credibility, it stops being just about ideas and starts becoming about identity and power. And that's where things can get messy fast. From the outside looking in, it doesn't just look like evolution, it looks like fragmentation. And that creates uncertainty, especially for people who aren't deeply plugged into every nuance of the conversation. And on something like foreign policy, where the stakes are real and the consequences are global, that kind of division can raise serious questions about consistency and direction. So I don't think this is a collapse, but I do think it's a moment where the movement has to decide what it actually stands for moving forward because right now there are multiple voices all claiming to represent that, and they're not all saying the same thing.
Yeah, and that word right there, fragmentation, that's the one that sticks. Because once people start seeing cracks, they start asking whether those cracks were always there to begin with, or if something triggered them. And Daniel, this feels like exactly the kind of situation where you'd say this didn't just happen overnight. So what's your take? Organic disagreement or something deeper at play?
Oh, this didn't just happen, not even close. And that's the part people need to understand if they actually want to see the full picture, instead of just reacting to headlines or clips. What you're watching right now is what happens when a movement that was originally built around disruption starts transitioning into influence and power, because those are two very different phases and they attract very different types of people. In the early phase, it's about breaking the system, challenging narratives, and uniting around broad principles. But once that movement starts gaining real influence, suddenly the stakes change. Now it's about direction, control, and who gets to define what comes next. And when you mix that with massive platforms, personal brands, financial incentives, and global issues like Iran that don't have simple answers, you get exactly what we're seeing now. Competing visions of the future colliding in real time. The question isn't whether this is happening, it's who benefits from it, and whether this division weakens the movement or reshapes it into something else entirely. Because historically, moments like this don't just resolve cleanly, they redefine everything.
That's a pretty heavy take because if that's true, then what we're watching isn't just a disagreement, it's a turning point. And Skylar, I want your perspective here, because from where you sit, outside of this movement looking in, does this look like growing pains, or does it look like something that was always going to happen?
Honestly, it looks inevitable, and not even in a cynical way, just in a structural one. When a movement builds itself around strong personalities, emotional energy, and opposition to a system, it can unify people very quickly, but that same structure can make it harder to maintain consistency once it becomes the system or starts operating within it. Because then the question shifts from what are we against to what are we actually for? And that's where differences start to surface in a much more visible way. From the outside, this doesn't look surprising. It looks like a movement reaching the point where it has to define itself beyond reaction and actually articulate a stable direction. And that's not always easy when the coalition includes people with different priorities, different interpretations of core principles, and different visions for the future. So I don't see this as collapse, but I do see it as a moment of pressure, and how that pressure gets handled is going to determine whether this becomes a stronger, more defined movement or a more divided one.
And that right there is the tension, because depending on how you look at it, this is either a sign of strength or a sign of stress. A movement fighting to define itself, or a movement struggling to hold itself together. And maybe the truth is it's both at the same time, because when something grows fast, when it gains power, when it starts shaping the future, instead of just reacting to it, this is what happens. The question is what comes next. Does it sharpen the message or fracture it even further?
All right, before we go any further, and before Brian and Daniel start forming factions over here, I'm going to take a second to remind you that if you're going to have strong opinions, you might as well look good while you're having them. The Data and Dissonance merch line is live, and it's built for exactly the kind of people listening to this show. People who think for themselves, speak their mind, and aren't afraid to stand a little outside the crowd. We've got everything from hoodies and tees to mugs, hats, and those bumper stickers that might get you a few looks at a red light. Honestly, depending on the day, that might be half the fun. And of course, the coffee lineup is still going strong because, let's be real, some of these conversations require caffeine and patience, and we're here to help with at least one of those. Whether you're rocking the High Lakes Light Roast, the Rock Creek Medium, or the Bitterroot Dark French Roast, you're supporting the show, the message, and everything we're building here. So if you want to rep the brand, support the podcast, and maybe stir up a little conversation of your own out in the real world, go check it out. Because if we're going to question everything, we might as well do it in a Data and Dissonance hoodie.
You know, sitting here listening to all of this play out, I think the one thing that becomes clear is that what we're watching right now isn't just a disagreement. It's a test, a real one. Not the kind you see in headlines or clips, but the kind that forces people to decide what they actually believe when the noise gets loud and the lines aren't so clear anymore. Because it's easy to stand firm when everyone around you is saying the same thing, when the message is unified, when the direction feels obvious. But moments like this is where things get uncomfortable. This is where people start asking harder questions, not just about others, but about themselves. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe a movement being forced to define itself again isn't weakness, it's pressure. And pressure either sharpens something or it breaks it. The truth is, no movement, no idea, no group of people stays exactly the same forever. It evolves, it adapts, it gets challenged. And how it responds to that challenge is what determines what it becomes next. The danger isn't disagreement. The danger is losing clarity, losing purpose, or letting personalities outweigh principles to the point where people don't even know what they're standing on anymore. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about who wins an argument on social media or who gets the last word in a podcast clip. It's about direction. It's about consistency. It's about whether people can still recognize what they're a part of, or whether it starts to feel like something completely different than what they signed up for in the first place. So maybe the better question isn't who's right. Maybe it's this: what actually holds up when everything around it starts shifting? Because that's what lasts, not the loudest voice, not the most popular take, but the things that stay consistent when it would be easier to change. We'll see where this goes. But one thing's for sure, this isn't over. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the world behind Data and Dissonance. And if you've been listening to the conversations, the themes, the tension we explore here, That same energy carries straight into the Caleb Rourke thriller series. You've got The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and now Black Echo Rising. Stories built around power, control, hidden agendas, and the kind of questions that don't always have clean answers. If you like what we do here on the show, those books take it even deeper, pulling you into a world where truth is layered, motives are never simple, and every move has consequences. And it doesn't stop there. The creative side of this brand also lives in the music, because sometimes a conversation hits one way and a song hits another. If you're into that raw, real, stripped-down sound, the album Uncaged leans into that grunge, pain, and personal struggle, stories shaped by life, loss, war, and everything that comes with it. Then you've got Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, bringing in that country roots feel, faith, family, freedom, and the kind of storytelling that feels grounded and real. Different sounds, same core message, real life, no filters. So whether you're diving into the books or turning up the music, it's all part of the same universe we're building here, Data and Dissonance.